All right, and we are live on the air for another episode of Paleo Bytes. This is basically a show where I have a relaxed style interview format with my guest, which this week is John Karf. I hope I said that right.
You absolutely did.
Yay!
Yay!
Um,
We should have
and
discussed that, and we didn't. So, wonderful.
well,
Good
it is a
job.
unique name. Awesome. And
Yeah.
John is Chief Operating Officer for Dogma Debate. He does a little bit of everything there. He's involved with publicity and coordinations, as well as being the tour manager and reporting the going-ons via a newscast by which he takes no breath that I can detect. He writes profiles for the folks who come on the show and does HR work. He was raised strictly Baptist at the age of 16. He came to the conclusion of being atheist and was promptly kicked out to find his own way around the world. He worked in radio for a time before becoming passionately involved in computer engineering and has run his business for over 30 years. So
I'm very, very, very old.
Are you over 50?
Outed me. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I will
Yes.
keep it at that out of respect.
Okay. Well, thank you. I don't care. I'm 60. So, for whatever it's worth. And
Okay,
in most settings, sitting down and talking with other atheists, I'm the oldest guy in the room. So that's okay with me. It's you're only as old as you're, as you are in your head, and I'm still still very, very immature. So it's fine.
Well, if it's any consolation, I thought you were in your 30s by your voice on Dogma Debate.
Oh, I love you.
So,
Oh my.
So of course, the first thing that kind of pops into mind when I mention you in your introductions and whatnot, two things: Dogma Debate, and the fact that you were outed at 16 and then promptly kicked out of the household.
Yep. Okay, so all of this sort of ties together, and
Okay.
if you want, I'll do the whole schmear. You're familiar
Go
with
right
the
ahead.
Thinking Atheist, right?
Yes,
Okay.
I've actually met him twice.
Oh, excellent. Did you hear the show that David was on?
Yes,
Okay.
that's actually
well,
how I found out about Dogma Debate.
Excellent. Do you remember the guy who called and talked about the woman who punched him in the face, and he
Yes.
ended up letting her go? You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
That was me. Okay, so we'll start at the beginning at 16. I, at 16 years old, was actually thinking about going to Northeastern Collegiate Bible Institute. I'm a native New Yorker, and I was going to be a preacher. My grandfather was a minister, and as such, by the time I was 16, I'd read the Bible cover to cover 8 times, and
Wow.
I was studying it more and understanding more. The last time through, I really started to understand things, and that made me a little crazy. I went to my pastors. I asked them questions, and theodicy is what gets most people, and is what got me. The question I asked my pastor was, he had a 3-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son. So I said, okay, you're sitting in front of your 3-year-old daughter, and she is deathly allergic to chocolate. So you sit down in front of her, you sit down a plate with grapefruits and lemons and oranges and bread and fish and chocolate. And you say to her, you can eat anything here you want. You just can't eat the chocolate. Now she's 3 years old. So then you get up from the table and your 10-year-old son comes by and says, you know he was lying to you. You can have the chocolate. You eat the chocolate. Because she's 3 and she doesn't know the difference between right and wrong, and because she's 3 and her older brother says to her, go ahead and eat the chocolate, she's going to eat the chocolate. And when she dies of anaphylactic shock, who's to blame? Her 10-year-old brother or the parent who put the chocolate in front of her? And I said, and now explain to me what the difference is between that and the Garden of Eden story. And their answer to me eventually was, you're looking at this with a carnal mind instead of a spiritual mind. And at 16, I was able to understand that I only had one mind, and I knew that that one mind was in the meat in my head.
Right.
Because if you take and stick a pick in your head, part of your mind goes away. So,
no lobotomies on this show.
right. So I had been working more or less full time from the time I was 13 years old. My parents more or less put me to work, and I gave my paycheck to my parents every week. My paychecks, I should say, because it was illegal for somebody that young to work more than 20 hours a week, and so I worked multiple jobs, and my employers didn't know each other, and I was working a lot. By the time I was 16, I was working 60 or 70 hours a week. And really, to be honest, I had no idea how much money I was making because I was really turning over my paychecks. So I was exhausted and told my brother, we slept in the same bedroom. I had 3 younger brothers and a younger sister at the time. And I told my brother what was going on in my head, and that I'd been talking to the pastor and some of the elders at the church, so the deacons, and I didn't like their answers, and I fell asleep. And 5 o'clock in the morning, my mother comes in the room screaming, woke me up. Are you an atheist? Now, had I had enough time to put my brains on, I would have said no. But I didn't. So what she got for me was an instinctive answer, and I said yes. So she yelled, "How dare you? How could you possibly think that? People much smarter than you are not atheists." I went to school. I come back from school, and I was changing clothes to go to work. My mother said, "Come into the kitchen." My parents were sitting at the kitchen table, and they said, "Sit down." And they looked at me and said, "We have to make a sacrifice. We cannot have you in the house with your younger brothers and sisters here because your ideas will send them to hell." Now, I understood perfectly where they were coming from. And because this is 1970, okay? This is some time ago. And in 1970, you could kick your 16-year-old out of the house and not get in trouble. So they basically said, "You have to leave." And I said, "Okay." And I started to go back upstairs to get some clothes, and they said, "No, no, no, you have to leave now." And they put me out of the house without a toothbrush, with the clothes I was wearing.
Jeez.
So I went to work, told my boss, "Hey, I don't have a place to live." He said, this is one of the places I was working. Actually, it was a Jack in the Box restaurant. And my boss said, "We have a garage apartment, and we'll rent it to you, and I know when you get paid, obviously, because I pay you, so don't worry about it." And I found out where the bus route was to go to school, and I did not cry, I did not mourn, I did not lament the fact that they kicked me out, because I understood absolutely why they had to do it, completely. Right. So, and to be honest with you, I didn't know how much money I was making. I was working 3 jobs, and I discovered I was making a living. I was making enough money to afford the apartment, to purchase plates and pans, and my first week there, I had no shower curtain, and all I had was a spoon. And I didn't know how much electricity cost, so my first month in that apartment, I did my homework by candlelight. I felt like Abraham Lincoln. So,
hey, that's a good person to feel like.
Well, my first electric bill was $7.30. I was like, oh, well, turn on the lights. So I discovered I was making a living. I bought a car. By then I had my license, so I bought a car. I bought a 1964 Impala. Which moved, and that was enough to get me to school and get me to my jobs every day. And I went to school, and I went to college, and I never looked back. Okay, wow. So that's 16 years old. Now, I never hid my atheism on purpose. I mean, if anybody ever asked me, they asked, "Do you believe in God?" the answer is no. And because of that, over the years, I've lost family, friends, clients, jobs, whatever. And I never really cared, because somehow I always managed to continue along just fine. My parents taught me how to live on my own, because they kicked my ass out of the house, and I knew how to make it. So I did. 1998, I was in a Winn-Dixie in Greenville, Mississippi, and in the produce aisle, and with a friend of mine, and he asked if I was interested in picking up any cruciferous vegetables. You know what cruciferous vegetables are?
No.
Broccoli, cauliflower. When you cut them, it looks like you cut them at the base, they're cross-shaped. That's why they're called cruciferous. Okay? The
I've not heard
cruciferous
that before.
vegetables are the vegetables in the cabbage family, more or less, and they're really, really good for you, full of vitamin C. And so you want to eat really, really good, healthy vegetables. You eat cruciferous vegetables. I made a joke. I said, no, I don't eat those damn things. I'm an atheist. Now, he already knew I was an atheist. We both laughed. I picked up an avocado. I looked around and saw this woman who was staring at me. She overheard me say that I was an atheist, and I could see the veins popping out in her head.
Oh, dear.
And I looked at her, and she reached back and punched me in the face and broke my nose. Next thing I know, I'm seeing stars. Now, what she didn't know, and it probably wouldn't have made any difference, is that my friend, Jeff, was an off-duty Mississippi State Patrolman. Had her on the ground, and I didn't know he was carrying handcuffs, but he had her on the ground and handcuffed in a second. I mean, that's what it seemed like, a second, okay? Marched her right outside to the car. The produce manager at the Winn-Dixie brought me some ice to put on my face, and so I went out to see what was going on with her, and it was just his regular car. It wasn't a patrol car or anything. I woke up to the car. She's in the back seat crying her eyes out. She said, I've always thought of myself as a God warrior. Those are her words. But I've never been physically violent with anybody. I have no idea what came over me. I am so sorry. I've never done anything like that before in my life. You know, I looked at her and I believed every word that she said, because I have seen people get nuts just because they overheard me say I was an atheist. Okay? Starting with my parents at the age of 16, the lesson I learned by the time I got to her in 1998, 28 years later, was she's telling the truth. So I looked at Jeff and I said, just let her go. And he looked at me like I was nuts, and he said, are you sure? You're crazy. And I said, no, just let her go. She was very happy to get out of the car. She scooted away. There was a guy who had been watching all of this. He came up and introduced himself. His name was John, and he introduced himself and his wife and his teenage son. And he said, did she call herself a God warrior? And I said, yeah. He said, we go to the same church, and boy, they use that term a lot. And I said, oh, okay. So we started to talk, and we talked for an hour. And my friend Jeff was being very patient because I was standing there with a busted nose and talking to this guy, and I wasn't begging him to take me to the emergency room, so he just put up with it. And this guy and I talked for an hour, and I watched him deconvert himself in that hour. By the time we were through with the conversation, he asked me, what is an atheist? How did you get there? He understood that I knew Scripture really, really well. And he said, where do you learn about this stuff? And, by 1998, there was none of this new atheist stuff. It was all, the only thing I knew was Madeline Murray O'Hare, the group in Austin, Texas, and stuff you find at the library. Or, or just take out your King James. The book that convinced me was the King James version of the Bible. So by the time we were through, he looked at me and he said, I guess all of this time that I thought I was talking to God, I was just talking to myself. Now, the reason I told you that story is because that's the story that I related to David and Seth on the Thinking Atheist.
Right.
Right. So, I was already a fourth listener, and Donovan was like handling social media. Donovan Baker, a very good friend of mine, was handling social media, and he had asked a question about what happened to you in your life that was weird about your deconversion process, whatever. And I had posted that story like 2 weeks earlier. So I told that story on the Thinking Atheist, and David, if you remember, said, you know what, John, I was just in Austin, and I was staying with Matt Dillahunty and Beth Presswood, and I told them your story because I saw it on the Facebook page. And Beth said, "Oh, that's wonderful that he let her go." And Matt said, "You know, she's going to think that the Lord softened his heart, and that's the reason why. That's the reason why you let her go." And I said, "I didn't let her go for her. I let her go because I understood where she was coming from, and more importantly, I didn't call to tell you about her. I called to tell you about the guy John that I was standing there talking to for an hour, where I had that conversation. And the reason why I listened to The Thinking Atheist and to Dogma Debate is because your conversations with Christians is very much like that conversation that I had with that Christian who deconverted himself." Okay, so you know, great call, see you later, hang up. I'm listening to the show's over with. 20 minutes later, I got a phone call. It's David Smalley. He had gotten the phone number from Seth, and he said, "I've been getting, I've gotten a couple of requests from people who want to be volunteers, and I don't know what to do with them, and I really need somebody to act as a coordinator, somebody to sign them up, assign them work to do. If the work they do, you assign them doesn't get done, somebody who would handle it. Do you have the time? Are you interested in doing that?" And I said, "Absolutely, that would be great fun."
Yeah.
So that's how that all ties together. Starting out with me, you know, getting kicked out of the house at 16, getting punched in the face in 1998, and that turning into me becoming the volunteer coordinator for Dogma Debate. And that, since November of last year, has grown to I became director of operations at one point, and now I'm chief operating officer, and you know, I do the little 5-minute news thing, and I also am the publicist for David and for the show, and I am his tour manager, and I still handle the volunteers, and I hire and fire people, kinda. We have moved some of the volunteers into positions. Alicia Koch is Director of Member Services. She's a volunteer. Cesar Morales and Michael Wood are senior research analysts, because we keep getting new volunteers, need to be trained how to do this sort of stuff. And I'm just thoroughly amazed and blown away by the quality of work and the dedication of these people who are just saying, "I want to help," and they raise their hands and they help. And the volunteer core of Dogma Debate is like the best kept secret in podcast land, because we have a staff like we're a $5 million a year corp, and we don't make any money. We don't make any money, but we make very little money, and we have a staff like we make tons of money, because people have dedicated their time to being activists. And all of that was new to me, and I just more or less just, you know, I come from the school of it's better to ask for forgiveness than it is for permission. So we just do stuff and wait till David says, "You know, that you pushed it a little far this time." Okay, fine. And that's the deal. And so and that's how that all ties together. So there you go. That's my story with that.
Awesome. So I'm gonna back up in your timeline a little bit.
Sure.
And when you were religious, you probably had a certain view on like LGBTQ and the abortion and all of that. How did your opinion on that change once you actually realized you were an atheist?
Well, you know, to be honest with you, I was 16, so I you know, the only thing I knew about in 1970, the only thing I knew about queers was I wasn't one. Really, that's it. You know, I mean, I knew that I was straight because I was attracted to girls. So,
right.
you know, on the football field at school, and I heard guys use pejorative terms and stuff, and it never crossed my mind. I really did not have an opinion. At least, I knew people who I assumed were gay. I knew guys who were effeminate, and I knew women who were masculine. And I didn't think about their sexuality, because at 16 I didn't think about anybody's sexuality. I knew that I was 16 years old, and I was, full of testosterone and attracted to girls, and I had a girlfriend that I met in church, and that was the only thing that I worried about in sexuality was whether I was whether we were gonna have sex or not, because that was a sin, so
right, the whole chastity thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely, right, of course. Now after I still lived in that environment. The people around me, the people I worked with, the people I went to school with didn't change just because I was an atheist. Nobody mentioned the fact that I was no longer wearing a cross, and I was the schmuck who carried a Bible to high school. I was that guy, right? So when people saw that I carried a Bible, they would come up and make requests of me, like, my grandfather is sick, will you pray for him? So when I quit carrying a Bible, I was still carrying other books. I was carrying lots of science fiction and other stuff, because I always was a fan of that stuff ever since I was 8 years old. So I was still carrying lots of books. I guess nobody really noticed that I wasn't carrying a Bible anymore. Occasionally people would still say, will you pray for my grandfather? And I'd say, sure. No skin off my nose, if it makes you feel better. I'll pray for you.
Right.
So there was, that abortion was not an issue. In 1970, the issue was the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. Okay, that was which failed, because it didn't make it through Congress as an amendment, and then of course the other route is to have it ratified in enough states, and then it automatically becomes an amendment to the Constitution, and it never made it to the threshold of, I think it's 35 states, 34, whatever. It never made it. So the Equal Rights Amendment was equal rights for women, and it failed. Okay, so that was the big thing. 1970 was still right in the heart of, there were hippies everywhere, and what we worried about? What we were worried about was, when I went to here's how old I am, I'm going to date myself. When I went to elementary school, we learned how to duck and cover. Get on your knees facing away from the windows under your desk every time the civil defense sirens go off. Because what we were worried about was, we were going to have 20 minutes warning before the eradication of the human species. Because if you're sitting at home and you look and all of a sudden the lights go out and it's a blackout, you look outside your window and it's dark, and you see a flash, and it occurs to you, what's going to occur to you is, oh, a transformer got hit by lightning or something. And that is really what most people, exactly. If this
especially was nowadays.
Well, yes, of course. In 1970, if there had been something particularly inflammatory on the news, we were still in Vietnam, if there'd been a lot of dead guys, or if there was something going on between Israel and Egypt, and the lights go off and you see a white flash, you might think to yourself, I wonder how close that flash was, because that flash may or may not be a nuclear explosion. You're not thinking it's a transformer, okay?
Right.
So it's a totally different mindset. We were worried about, at the age of 16, what I was worried about was, in the next year and a half, I might end up having to pack my clothes and head to Saigon. Right, so we had a different agenda. I missed the draft by 2 days My 18th
Wow.
birthday was April 2nd, 1972, and the draft ended March 31st, 1972. The extension for the draft sat on Richard Nixon's desk, and all he had to do was sign it to extend the draft. At the time, there was a lottery. So at the beginning of the year, every year, they put 365 balls, one with every date on it, in a bingo thing, and they pulled out those dates, and so that way, it wasn't just people, January through March, their birthdays that got called up. It was they got called up in the order of that they were pulled out of the hopper, and
Huh.
April 2nd was number 65 that year, and anything under 120, you were guaranteed to be called up. So, had he signed that, I would have been drafted. Absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, I would have been drafted. So, that's what I worried about. So like I said, we had a slightly different mindset, slightly different agenda. We were worried about other stuff. It was the middle of the sexual revolution. It was the middle of the drug revolution. So we
Right.
were just experimenting with pot and whatever else showed up in the neighborhood. It was the era of, supposedly free love. It was pre-herpes, pre-AIDS, pre-lots and lots of scary stuff. So, people would still use pejorative words for black people and pejorative words for gay people and say it right there in front of those folk, and just said it because that's the word they always heard, not
Right.
because they meant it to be derogatory or pejorative.
Right. There's a story in my family. I don't know if you've ever seen them, but they're little things that stick out from the side of a tire to let you know that you're really close to the curb.
Yep.
So
Yep.
yeah.
Curb
My mom,
feelers.
yeah, my mom always grew up calling them nigger feelers.
Mm-hmm.
And it came from my grandfather, but he was actually genuinely racist and told her it was just so you could feel out if there were niggers laying in the street. So of course
Right.
when my dad came along, he just kind of looked at her like, "What are you saying?" She's like, "Well, that's what they're called, aren't they?" He's like, "No,
Yeah.
it's a curb feeler." So,
As a child, you do Rochambeau, rock, paper, scissors, or
yeah.
eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a nigger by the toe.
Yeah.
It's like nobody, that was just a word. It became abundantly obvious by the middle of the 70s after, that there was Black Panthers, Black Power, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. The
Right.
year that actually changed lots of stuff for me and for an awful lot of other people was 1968. There were riots that year. Martin Luther King was assassinated that year. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated that year. It was a hell of a year. Richard Nixon was elected president that year. It was a hell of a year. And I knew that I was a liberal for whatever it's worth. In 1968 at the age of 14. The first time I got to vote was 1972 at the age of 18, and that was the first year that 18-year-olds were allowed to vote. People were before then you had to be 21, and
Right.
what gave 18-year-olds the right to vote was Vietnam, because the protest was, we can go fight your wars, but we can't vote, and that changed America.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was interesting. Yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on. So that was, I moved to Houston. I graduated from the University of Texas in 1976 with a degree in communications, and that got me out and around and in different cities and seeing stuff. New Orleans, Houston, Santa Barbara, California, Chicago. So I ran into folks from every stripe in our society at one point or another, and there's nothing better to destroy prejudices than to just meet folk. You
Right.
know, and travel. You know, we'll do it really well. And that's what did it for me. You know, it's like I made friends with all kinds of folk, and then discovered that they fit in one category or another, and discovered that I didn't care. You know, so.
So, from the fact that you lived in '60s and '70s and such, do you remember anything about when "Under God" was suddenly shoved in the Pledge of Allegiance at all?
That was the year I was born, 1954.
Okay, so you
Okay.
were already. It
Always.
was
It
just
was always
there.
there. Yep. Now, in 1971, my homeroom teacher said, according to the Supreme Court, if there's anybody in here who doesn't want to stand and say the Pledge of Allegiance, you don't have to. By this time, I'd moved to upstate New York, small town called Saugerties, had a fairly liberal and sort of semi-affluent suburb about 90 miles north of New York City, and so the homeroom teacher notified me, and I sat through the Pledge of Allegiance out of abject laziness, just because it was early in the morning. I worked a lot, and I just didn't feel like standing up. So, you know, and I do remember just not saying "Under God" on purpose because I was an atheist starting in 1970. I just didn't say that, and nobody noticed, and so I didn't care. You know,
Well,
it struck me as odd, even as a little child, that we were pledging allegiance to a hunk of cloth, which is weird. It's like we're
yeah,
saying,
it
okay,
is when you
okay,
stop
piece
and
of
think about it.
cloth, I'm promising you, piece of cloth, that I'm going to be a good citizen. I'm not promising all of the people who died for our freedom. The 60s is not much further. It's not much further along from the 40s. You know, the World War II and Korea and Vietnam were all fresh in our minds and our heads, and so
Right.
so we were very cognizant. I lost friends, and you know, in my neighborhood, what you hated to see was a U.S. government car that said U.S. government on the side pull up in front of one of your friend's house and have two officers get out. Usually one of them was female, and you knew why they were there. They were there to notify you that Frankie's older brother isn't coming home, not to notify his mother. Okay, that's why they were there. So that's what you didn't want to see. So we were very cognizant of the fact that, you know, it was but you know, battle lines at the time were being drawn. You know, Kent State kids were being shot, you know, just for protesting. You know, there was the long-haired hippies, you know, the peaceniks. You know, the peace sign was called the it looked like, because it's shaped, you know, sort of like, you know, like this, you know, it looks like
the peace sign.
footprint of a bird, and it was called the footprint of the Great American Chicken, is what conservatives used to call it.
I haven't heard that
it looked
before.
like a chicken footprint. Yeah, I know, because it's, you know, that's obscure, but
well, still, it's interesting.
yeah, that is, you know, so they were, you know, they'd yell, you know, get a haircut, and you know, I had long hair, and I would yell back, brush your teeth, old man. So, you know, the whole that part of the culture became sort of normalized. Everybody had long hair, and everybody wore bell bottoms, and everybody had shirts with huge collars. It was all ugly, but it was different than what our parents wore, was skinny little ties and very small collars, and, you know, and straight leg, you know, pants, and that came up really high. We used to call them high waters, and because it looked like you were waiting for a flood, and white socks and penny loafers. You know, it's like we sure look different than them. And we look different from them to look different from them, not because it was particularly, you know, cool or whatever. And what changed for the the way fashion changed for women is that they could wear anything, everything from really, really, really short dresses to what they called granny dresses to pants. And so dress codes in schools disappeared during that time. Before then, there was some pretty strict dress codes, but it just got to the point where it was ridiculous and absurd. Anytime you had a friend whose name was Summer, or Sunshine, or Dharma, or or Brahma, or something like that, you knew that their parents were hippies and they were going to come dressed to school weird. So that pushed the envelope for all of us.
Do you remember anything about Helter Skelter?
Of course.
I just recently listened to a really long audio book of it's actually titled Helter Skelter, and it goes into the background.
Sure.
Yeah.
I read it when it first came out.
Awesome. Yeah, I just finished listening to that a while back, and I mean, obviously you were around when that was going on. What was that impacting you at all whatsoever at the time?
That was out in California. The whole, in upstate New York, there were communes that I was familiar with. There were hippie communes.
Right.
And there were also religious communes. The beginning of some of the cult sort of stuff. There was one leader who would take, and I worked in restaurants. Is the way I earned my way through much of, high school and college. And so we would see these kids come in who had been dropped off by their leader, who would come begging for food, and we would usually give them food. And once you gave them food once, it was they were like a dog. They came back all constantly begging for food for their whole group. It's
right.
And eventually they became annoying, and we'd kick them away. We'd say, get out of here. You're just becoming annoying now, and like, we fed you because you were hungry yesterday. Go find somebody else tomorrow. This is it. This is all you get. Because that was their job, was begging. And we'd see the guy drop them off, at different restaurants to beg for food. We didn't understand that, begging for food was I think it was a Buddhist tradition, that's how monks lived. And some of them were, the Hare Krishnas were showing up then. Okay, you showed your cat. This is Meg. She decided she wanted to climb up my leg. We saw the guys with the weird hair and wearing pajamas all the time, and eventually, we just said, go away. You guys are just standing on those street corners singing and begging for food, and that's obnoxious. But that actually, I was like, they have a totally different view. And that was one of the things that actually started my, after I figured out the Bible was, to be frank, bullshit. That's, before I graduated from high school, I had read the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedas and I Ching and the Tao and everything I could get my hands on to figure out if there was anything out there that made any sense. Confucius said there are many roads to the top of a mountain, and so I figured, well, maybe I'm just not picking the right road. Maybe Christianity is not for me, but maybe there's one of these other things that are. And they all had one fatal flaw. You had to believe in something in order for it to be true. And that, of course, is by then I'd figured out that I wanted to live in an evidence-based world. When I was a Christian, I spent a good portion of my day in meditation and in what I believed was constant contact with Jesus. I was, and that felt great. The 20 minutes I spent every morning and just before I went to school, and the hours that I spent in the evening, and the times I spent on my break in meditation was great for me mentally. It felt good. Of course, I eventually figured out I could do all that stuff without Jesus. So,
Right, I remember the same feeling myself. I was raised Roman Catholic, so you can
right,
imagine it's
sure.
every Sunday you have that set ritual of what
Hmm.
you do in church, and then after that we would go to the potluck or the little breakfast lunch thing after
Hmm.
church. And the first thing you did before you ate was we sat down and we prayed not only a grace, but typically, we are going to pray for this person in the church so that they are healed. And I honestly felt like I was directly, like you said, contacting with God.
Sure.
And and then of course when you realize that that's not quite what's going on.
So, what did you think about transubstantiation?
At the time, I
Uh-huh.
didn't think anything weird about it.
Right.
It was just, it was what it was. It had changed into the body and blood of Christ. Um, my first communion, I was really excited because I got to choose which wine was used for the mass.
Wow.
So, of course, I got these little tiny, like, quarter of a shot glass type
Right.
thing where
Hmm.
I could drink wine. I was more excited about that than it seems now that I look back on it than I really was about the fact that it was going to become the blood of Christ.
Right.
I was more, okay, I want something sweet so that everybody gets something different than what they normally get.
Uh,
Um,
and that was part of the ritual of growing up, is
right.
right. I mean, yeah, I remember the first time.
And then, of course, go ahead.
No, I just remember the first time, that I took communion too, and to me, it felt very much like the first time I drank coffee. It was just part of the ritual of, being a grown up. I was being
Right.
responsible for my own soul at that point, where I wasn't before.
The whole
So,
age of reason thing.
yeah, 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 exactly, exactly. Yep, that's what it felt like.
Um, I remember with the host or the little communion wafer cracker
Wafer.
thing that
Mm-hmm.
people, yeah. Um, I was really freaked out because I was told that you can't chew it because somehow that is causing physical harm to Jesus. But
I never heard that before.
my mind wasn't connecting of, wait a minute, I am consuming this. I have stomach acid that can dissolve, bone if it's in my stomach for long
Sure.
enough. How is this not causing harm if I can't touch my
Wow.
teeth? So I
Wow.
consistently end up with the host stuck to the roof of my mouth, and people could see me like moving my jaw, trying to push it with my tongue to get it
Wow.
off the roof of my
That
mouth.
that's great. I never. Well, I've always heard, the Catholic kids in my neighborhood always got told the weirdest crap by the nuns. Every time you blank, you put another, you hammering the nail a little harder into
Yep.
Jesus' or hands or whatever.
Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like, you make Jesus cry every time you do that. Boy, they played. I lived in Brooklyn. I lived in a very diverse neighborhood. The people who lived on the bottom floor was the Jewish family. They had the Cohens. We lived on the next floor up, and the Catholics, the Italian family, the Scopos, lived above us. Um, the Catholics didn't eat meat on Friday, so we all ate gefilte fish with the Jewish
Yep.
family on Fridays, and we had roast beef at our place on Saturdays, and Sundays we had Sunday gravy. That's pasta and tomato sauce with the Italian family above us. I used to make a lot of money. Um, Doing stuff during Jewish high holy days. Not a lot of money. A lot of money for a little kid, get a nickel for turning on the light or turning on the stove or going to get groceries or because they couldn't work, sundown on
Right.
Fridays. Yeah. So I lived in a, very diverse neighborhood. And so to me, it was like a guilt off between the Catholics and the Jews. It's like you're making Jesus cry, and for the Jews, it was you're making your mother cry.
Yep.
So, yep. So it was like, who could make whom feel more guilty? The more shame, the better. Shame on you. Oh man, I heard that so much. Yeah, it was kind of interesting growing up in Brooklyn in the 50s and 60s.
It sounds like it would have been.
Yeah.
So I actually don't know all that much about Baptists.
Hmm.
When I was raised, it was, oh, they're doing it, but they're doing it in kind of a weird way or whatever. And that was the way that all religions were exposed to me, was like, they'll
Hmm.
eventually get to Christ. They're just doing it in a different way than us,
Wow.
with the exception of Wiccan. But so
Hmm.
you asked me about the consecration of the host and the transfiguration and all that.
Hmm.
How how do Baptists actually deal with communion?
Communion is the first Sunday of every month. It's sort of after the Sunday services. People who want to take communion stay, and they bring out a big old tray with little shot glasses full of grape juice, and they also have crackers, usually saltines, because Baptists are poor. So they don't have special wafers with crosses on them like the Catholics got. And it was grape
Which
juice
taste
because
horrible, by the
Baptists
way.
don't drink. Yeah, yeah, I understand. Um, so we were taught it was it was strictly symbolic. You weren't actually eating the flesh of Christ and the blood of Christ, but you were ritually eating Jesus' flesh and drinking his blood, but it was symbolic. It was, that's all it was. The thing about it was, if you did that and had not gotten in the right place with the Holy Spirit, you were condemning yourself to hell. That was the whole trick. You better make sure that if you needed to ask forgiveness from somebody or whatever to get yourself right with the Holy Spirit, because the whole idea of communion was one of the part of that ritual was that you were receiving the Holy Spirit, and if you weren't right, you were in trouble. Baptists baptize not as children. When you become a member of the church, whatever the church, when you go to a new church, that's one of the ways you can say, I want to be a member of this church. I just moved here, is to get baptized all over again. So you're proclaiming your faith in front of everybody in a big, very cold pool of water behind the pulpit, where you and the pastor get in robes, and he says, do you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior and Lord? And you say yes, and he says, I baptize you in the name of the Father, dunk, the Son, dunk, and the Holy Spirit, dunk, and then everybody goes, yay, you're one of us now. We always thought Catholics were weird because there was incense and there was actual wine, and boy, they had statuary of dead Jesus everywhere, and
Including around your neck.
Right, and right, Protestants, no, you never find Jesus on those crosses. Never with Protestants, because Jesus is risen. He's not dead. He's not on the cross. See, that was sacrilege, and that's the difference. And also, the whole idea for Protestantism is you do not need an intercessionary. No priest. You don't talk to the priest to talk to Jesus. You talk to Jesus directly, and you don't talk to no saints. Okay, saints are nice people and everything, but the Book of Acts is like, that's it. There's there may be people who will be considered saints, but past the Book of Acts, we don't make any new saints. There's no, we don't care what you do. That's it. That was the end of it. It got closed then for official saints. But you don't pray to intercede on your behalf. There's no need for that, because the whole idea of all of Martin Luther's 99 theses that he nailed to the door of the church was that you did not need anybody to talk to to God, or you needed Jesus to talk to God, because God could not even look upon sin. So Jesus would absorb your sin. He was the firewall, quite literally. And then Jesus could relay whatever you needed to God, and that He was your intercessionary. Period. So although Protestantism, came from Catholicism, they really don't like to admit that. You
Huh.
know, I know Protestants, I know Baptists who believe Christ was a Christian, not a Jew, because they have a problem with that whole Jew thing. Although they sing a song in church, where the words are, it's called "Give Me That Old Time Religion," where the words are, "It was good enough for Moses, so it's good enough for me." Well,
Yeah.
what are they talking about? What was good enough for
That
Moses?
old time
Judaism,
religion.
right? If it's good enough for Moses, it's good enough for me. If it's good enough for Jesus, if it's good enough for Elijah, well, they're not singing about Judaism. They're not
Yeah.
singing, because Christ was not a Christian. Much to their chagrin and surprise, he was not a white guy, and not a Christian. And that's of course a problem. So they don't think about that, and that's how they
Right.
handle lots of stuff, by not thinking about it. Yeah.
I
So
I
So when
understand
I
that.
and that's what got me. That's what killed me. That's what knocked me out, was because I decided to think about it. I used the same brain that I used for everything else, and tried to apply my skills that I used just to be alive. I tried to apply those skills to um, what I thought that I needed to learn about the Bible, about God, and about Jesus, in order to continue my education in religion, in order to be able to save souls for Christ. And that's what got me, because that's when I discovered that it was a flawed document.
Right.
And we were taught it was the breathed word of God.
Yeah,
So,
the
wow.
perfect inerrant word of God for
Yeah.
me, but essentially the same thing. All right, I'm going to let us both take a 3-minute break for bathroom, water, whatever you need, and
Okay.
I'll be right back in just a minute.
Okay.
I unfortunately don't have any fancy commercials for the breaks.
Oh, say what? What was that?
I said I unfortunately don't have any fancy commercials for the breaks.
So are you gonna edit that out, or is that are you just gonna have people just like?
I actually intend on eventually putting these up as hopefully video podcasts on iTunes. So I might be able to actually add some sort of little
There you
commercial
go.
type thing in. But I guess in lieu of that, for anybody who's actually watching or listening later on, if you want to get on the show, there's a link down in the description box of how to do that. Just fill out the form. It makes it really easy. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can, and we'll get you on the show. If
And
you're
it's
in a
great
different
fun.
time. Yes, it is fun. If you're in a different time zone, I am not averse to actually doing pre-recorded shows on a different time or a different date. That way I can just upload them. I don't do any editing in terms of the actual YouTube videos, simply because there have been some discussions with particular theists about how they like to complain that, oh, you edited this or you edited that to make it look like I said something different. I don't like that, so I don't do it. So, back to the show then.
Okay.
And I'm going to turn and talk a little bit about the whole atheist stuff.
Okay.
So we know you were raised in a religious background. Obviously, you had a very specific idea of what God was. But when you were raised, what was the concept of atheist, other than obviously being shoved out of your household?
Yeah.
I mean, were they Satan worshippers,
Oh
baby
yeah,
eaters,
absolutely.
or?
Well, they wanted to sin. It's really that simple. They rejected God. They willfully rejected God because they wanted to sin. You know, Christians want to sin too, and they do. So,
Yeah.
which to me is strange. You know, if the theology was, even though you're saved, okay, here's the deal. In Christianity, once you're, you know, especially in Protestant type of Christianity, once you're saved, you are always saved. You have fire insurance, right? So even if you're an asshole, if once you've been saved, the difference is this: the size of the mansion that you and how close you get to live to Jesus in heaven is determined by your actions after you become a Christian. So if you're a Christian and you're a great guy after you become a Christian, then you'll have a bigger house and you'll live closer to Jesus. You'll live in the right neighborhood. If you, after you've been saved, you're a jerk, well, then you'll live in a shack down by the river. So and that's the only difference. So for my friends, all they cared about was they had fire insurance. Yep, I'm saved. I have fire insurance. I can pretty much do whatever I want. So I'll live in a shack. Who cares? I will still be in heaven, not in hell. So that's the deal.
Right.
Yeah. So as far as atheists were concerned, well, they were heading to hell. Period. For eternity, they were going to burn. You know, and every second in hell was like in itself an eternity, you know, and that was, you know, and of course they scared us with that all the time. So,
Right.
you know, that was another question that I asked my pastors was, if I told my child at the age of 3, because he had a 3-year-old daughter, if you said, you went to your 3-year-old daughter and you said to her, I don't care how you feel about me right now, but before you reach the age of 6, you have to love me. Otherwise, I'm going to throw you in the oven and burn you to death. How would you feel about the quality of her love when at the age of 6 she comes to you and says, yes, I love you? Because she's doing it because she knows you're going to throw her in the oven. And what's the difference between that and salvation? Because when we tell Jesus we love him, we're doing it, you got to do it before you die. As long as you do it before you die, you're good. You're not going to get thrown in the oven. And so, what is the quality of your love for somebody when you have to love them under duress and not because, and is that really free will? So, yeah.
Yeah. So you brought up free will.
Mm.
A lot of times we hear the concept of, well, you have free will to reject God, but obviously, if you do reject him, you'll be thrown into hell. As an
Right.
atheist, how do you view free will? Do we have it? Do we not have it? Is it a product of our own mind?
I have no clue. And that's because I'm not really sure about the nature of consciousness. Okay.
Okay.
I think maybe consciousness is something that happens after you reach a certain threshold of connectivity, and I think it may be a quantum function, which means part of our consciousness may actually occur outside of our own little time-space thing, because although normal space for us is your basic 4 dimensions that we live in, there are 10. And that's the reason why in completely empty space you have things that pop into and out of existence all the time. So because I don't really understand the nature of consciousness, I don't really understand the nature of what you would call free will. I know what will is.
Mm-hmm.
Look, people tell me all the time, ask me all the time, do you believe in, fill in your word, Jesus, evolution, whatever. I do not understand the concept of believing in something. I understand the concept of believing something, okay? I believe that the sun's going to rise tomorrow based on my previous experience and the previous experience of everybody who's lived on this planet and seen the sun come up the next day. And what we understand about cosmology and gravity and all the other sort of stuff, I believe, but I don't believe in the sun. Okay, so, right, okay, I believe this is a table that I'm banging on right here, but I don't believe in the table. And I might believe that the table would hold me up if I stood on it. That still doesn't mean that I believe in the table. Okay, I don't know what that means. And by the same token, I don't understand what free will means. Can I be willful? Yes. Can I make decisions based on every variable that affects me, and including those variables that I don't understand, that I have no control over, that are biological, that can be biological in nature and can short circuit what I believe to be my will? Yeah. I have had chemical imbalances in my body from time to time, and I can tell you that because of that, I have made poor choices. I have had hormonal imbalances in my body that have contributed to me making poor choices that I know I would not have made had things been, what we look for and what doctors look for is a stasis, for stuff to more or less continue the same. What you don't want to see is fluctuations and stuff. And I've been through periods of where things fluctuated, and that kind of stuff will make you nuts. And you can't. And sometimes it's hard to think through that. I lived through the '60s and '70s, so I purposely screwed with my sense of reality. And I can tell you that because of that, I had weight loss surgery 8 years ago. When I went to the hospital to have weight loss surgery, I weighed 615 pounds. And
Wow.
and I had actually lost about 35 pounds before I went to the hospital to have that surgery. I couldn't get a doctor here in Jacksonville to actually do the surgery because I was too fat, and they all told me I had to lose weight before I went in, and I said if I could lose the weight, I wouldn't be here. I found a doctor in Ocala, which is about an hour and a half south of here. And I went in, and I was you know, even at 615 pounds, I was functioning, I was working, I was making a living, and my insurance didn't cover it. So, you know, I went in to see this doctor in Ocala, and I said, and he said, he looked at me and said, "When do you want surgery?" I said, "Tomorrow." He said, "Be here at 5 in the morning," and I handed him a check for 16 grand, and he cut me open the next day. Now,
Wow.
after the surgery, there were complications, and because of those complications, I hallucinated my ass off. I can tell you that I saw water moving in the paintings on the walls. I saw pipes moving through the walls. I had conversations with people where I would be talking to them, and then part of the conversation would be in my head, and then I would continue the conversation with them when they didn't realize that I had actually had part of the conversation in my head, and I didn't realize part of the conversation was in my head.
Right.
But because I had had experience screwing with my sense of reality a long time ago, I was able to actually keep my head together enough. They didn't want me to let me out of the hospital. They wanted blood transfusions and all kinds of other crap. And I knew all I needed to do was just to get home and get some sleep because I was getting no rest in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
So I managed to put on a straight face, although I was still hallucinating my ass off. I managed to look past all those hallucinations and look past all their weird faces and look past all the wavy walls and all the other crap that was going on. And I managed to convince them that I was fine, and got somebody to take me home. I got home, I took some pain medication, and I slept for 3 days, and when I woke up, I felt a lot better. So my sense of reality, I have played with it before, and I can tell you that it is plastic. So what my will is I was able to willfully ignore and willfully walk past things that my senses and what my brain was doing with that sensory stuff, and what kind of pictures and sounds and thoughts were popping into my head. I was able to parse those because I had experience. I can imagine if I had not had that experience, that I would not have been able to make the choices that I made. So,
right.
As far as exactly what will is, and as far as, you know, and how much of it is determined by your biology, by your environment, by your genetics, by whatever you just ate, by the people around you, I haven't a clue. So I don't know. All I know is I attempt to function in the world as if I know what I'm doing. You know, the expression "fake it till you make it"? Well, I've been doing that for 60 years, okay? And really, I mean, I get up every morning and I'm pretty sure the floor is there, and, you know, when I get up and I'm pretty sure it's like I'm pretty sure only a few hours have gone by, and, you know, not months. And I'm pretty sure, you know, I remember what happened yesterday and stuff. I'm pretty sure. But that's really all I am. Okay? And so I make no guarantees about reality or anything else, other than it doesn't matter what, it doesn't matter whether it's real or not. I have to act as if it is. I use what I tell people I use is the test of my 4-year-old grandson. Okay, I have a 4-year-old grandson, and I asked him. His name is Evan, and I said, "Evan, what color is the sky?" And he said, "Blue." And so I tried to pull a Ken Ham on him, and I said, "How do you know it's blue?" And he looked at me and he said, "Don't be stupid, Grandpa." And you know what? That's exactly the deal. So when people tell me shit like that, where they say, "How do you know?" I just say, "Don't be stupid, Grandpa," because it's blue, okay? And you know what? It doesn't matter. If you could look through my eyes and see that it's pink, it wouldn't matter, because you and I have to agree that whatever that particular electromagnetic wavelength is that we're looking at, we're going to call it blue. And that's the way you have to function in life. It doesn't matter if you really are a brain in a jar. It wouldn't matter. It just doesn't matter. You can't function that way. I can tell you that if you don't eat, you will starve and die, because I came real close to doing that. So I can tell you that that's what happens. So even if you say I don't have to eat, I'm a brain in a jar, and they're just going to keep pumping chemicals into my head, and they're going to feed me. No, they're not. You're going to starve and you're going to die. So even if somebody is willfully starving you because you're thinking that you're not eating, whatever kind of permutations you need to go through mentally to get there, doesn't matter. If you act like an idiot, then idiotic things are going to happen. So you have to act as intelligently as you can and assume that everything is real, that you touch and smell and see and hear and breathe and stuff, because that's how we have to function. So
well, I like that answer.
Okay. Good. I mean, I thought about free will, been thinking about it, since I was a kid, and finally I just basically have thrown up my hands and said, I haven't a clue.
That works.
Okay.
I haven't done much study into the whole free will thing myself, so I like asking about that. Actually, Matt said on Facebook, it was either last night or today or something, that when he dies, he needs to have his brain preserved in a vat in a museum somewhere.
Yeah, I saw that, and yes, he should, because that's people keep trying to they give it as a surmise that, well, so that would be the ultimate irony, that he would be a brain in a jar pretending to be a brain in a jar.
Yep. Yeah. So, obviously, we've mentioned that you work with David Smalley and Dogma Debate, and your icon actually has you with the Fourth Listener shirt on.
Yep.
And you arrange for guests to come on, if I understood correctly. You get to talk to them.
I book people. I both book people, and I have done. Normally now I'm busy enough that I pass most of that stuff off onto other volunteers, because I'm a volunteer too. I don't get paid.
Right.
So normally what I do, if either I book somebody or they book somebody, it's up on the schedule. I'll take a look and say, hey, we've got some guy we've never heard of before, and I'll have his contact information for him. Let's go find out. And so I hand that off to two volunteers, and one of them is primary and the other is secondary. The primary guy hands off stuff to the secondary guy or woman, and then I have templates that we've put together that have the basic format that David needs to see. First, we put together a bio, best we can. David can't read all of everybody's books and see all their movies and all that other sort of stuff. Right. So we do. Okay, I make sure that we have seen every movie, read every book. That's why I always make sure there's at least two researchers on every person, and that way. And then we take all their materials and their bio, and then we create a bunch of questions. Then we contact them and ask for a phone call, and sometimes if they're famous, they're like Les Stroud, the Survivor guy. He's coming on soon, so we're dealing with his assistant. But
I'm actually looking forward to that.
Oh yeah, it should be fun. I mean, because he does believe in a little bit of woo, so that's going to be interesting. Bigfoot and stuff like that. So that should be an interesting conversation. We're still working on his profile. Then we call them up and ask them. We give them a heads up on what it's going to be like. How many segments they'll be on, and how the show runs, and more or less make them as comfortable as we can. And then we ask them what they want to talk about, and normally they've got something that they want to plug: a book, a movie, a blog, whatever. So then we get a bunch of questions from them, and we take their questions, make them nice and red, so that David can see those. And then, so if you've ever watched the video of Dogma Debate and seen David interviewing somebody and seen his laptop sitting in front of him. That document you'll see there with the picture, you'll see pictures of the person he's talking to. That's the profile that we create. It's usually a 2-page profile of, if the person is famous, it's easy. If the person is unknown, like that guy who was on just a few nights ago, the Christian guy who was on, I called him up and did his bio. He's a truck driver from Texarkana, so I can't just go on Wiki and pull down his bio.
Right.
So it's a little bit harder when when there's no information on the net, but it's still all basically the same thing. And normally I pass that sort of stuff off because we've got enough volunteers that I can do that. I just booked Jeremy, the Christian who was on episode 79. That was one of the episodes that Jerry DeWitt was on. And this is a guy who believed that Genesis is literal, but he believes in that the Earth is 4 billion years old and that it was already a populated planet, and that the first people with free will is what Genesis is talking about. Before then, people didn't have free will. His name is Jeremy. And I just booked him for August 27th, and I just passed off his profile to one of the, and to one of the volunteers. I booked him and then passed that off. So yeah, Lydia, who's brand new to the show, Jason Como, who is brand new to the show as sound producer. I interviewed both of them. Phil Kaiser, who does all of the web stuff in the background. I interviewed him. So usually when somebody's getting ready to do something for the show, whether they're staff or on air, because my background is I worked on radio for years. My background, I have a degree in communications. Before my hobby, when I was in high school, and what I thought I was going to be one day was a famous cook. There are chefs and cooks in my family. I have a cousin who was one of those celebrity chefs. His name is Sam Hazen. He's been on the Today Show. He's been on Emerald's show, and he has been the executive chef for a bunch of famous restaurants like Tao and Rue 57 and Tavern on the Green. And I thought I was going to be a chef. My hobby was radio. My hobby, my avocation, became my vocation by the time I got out of college. Then I did radio for years, and I was production director, which means you make commercials, and I have a few Addy Awards for some of the commercials I did, and I was news director and also on-air guy, and a regular announcer in Top 40, album-oriented rock and roll, public radio, country. It didn't matter. I was a professional, so I didn't care what the format was. It was always, I was selling personality. I didn't care. So, but my hobby was computers, and my avocation again became my vocation. This job that I have, I still have a consultancy, and that's how I pay my bills. This allows me to throw all this stuff together because we communicate now digitally, like we're doing right now.
Right.
IT is still involved. When I was doing radio, I used to dream about actually, and I was doing all kinds of right brain stuff. I was writing commercials, and I was being very creative, and I loved that. But I also felt like the side of me that was an engineer, that was a scientist, was not being fed. And so I played with computers, and I taught myself how to program in Octal and all sorts of cool stuff. And then when that became my living, that was great for a long time, and I would have dreams that I went back on the air. And and in my dreams I'm like, I haven't done this in years. I don't know what I'm doing. But the right side of my brain, although in computers if you have the time, you can still be creative. You can play with Adobe Premiere and do video stuff and Photoshop and do, and you can write and do other stuff that is sort of creative. But for the most part, for a living, the stuff that I do for a living is because I understand everything that goes on in every one of these computers on a 0 and 1 level. And I've done it for so long that just like any specialty, once you understand the synergy of how everything has to work, you can eventually get to the point where you intuit everything. And so most of the time, I'll get a call, hey, this is wrong, and I'll say, okay, do this, and that will fix it. And they'll say, how did you know that? And most of the time, I have to say, I have no idea how I know it. Just trust me, that will work. Because I no longer because I can shortcut it, because I know how it has to work. So I can intuit the correct answer. I don't have to sit there and because computers are very linear and you can just go right down the line, and I'm fast. I skip all that stuff, and that's how I manage to continue to make money at this. So what this does is allows me to put it all together. I get to play with my radio stuff. I have had my own business for 30 years, and so I'm actually running David's business. That's what the COO does. I'm managing people, and so I get to isolate him from having to do the HR stuff because I'm really good with that. I love working with people, and so I get to do all the volunteer stuff, which is just killer. And here's the thing, you said that that one of the things in your show that you do that's different is you give people a chance to ask you questions at the end, right?
Yep.
Well, see, here's the deal. One of the things that I do I do a hangout or a Skype call with every volunteer for a couple of reasons. One reason is to make sure they're not crazy, because we have had people who you might say are overly enthusiastic. Okay.
I was gonna ask if you had any batshit crazy.
Oh yeah. Well, we've had approximately 100 or so applications for volunteer, and we have 35 active volunteers. Okay, and we haven't kicked anybody off, and that's because the process is, although it's not daunting, there's paperwork that we require that they sign. There's non-disclosure and conflict of interest paperwork, and we want everybody to understand that we're humanists, that we will always choose to be the heroes instead of the jerks. We will always choose to do the right thing because it's the right thing and not because it's the expedient thing ever. And we do that because we're humanists and because we're just volunteers, and we are representing a business. We're representing Dogma Debate and Atheist Audiobooks. And so even though it may be more work for us, too bad. If you're not interested in doing more work, then we've got lots of volunteers. So that's fine. So right. So part of the process is I spend at least a half an hour, usually an hour to an hour and a half, with every single volunteer, and so I get to know them, and I tell them the same story I told you about being kicked out of the house at 16, about being calling into the Thinking Atheist, about what David said on that show about telling my story to Matt and Beth, and then I get to the point where I say to them, okay, you've heard my story. Everybody has a story. What's yours? And that's my question for you.
How long do you have?
I have to be somewhere about noon tomorrow.
Okay. I will answer you, but I have one last question for you.
Go ahead.
I like to ask everyone.
Okay, that's fine.
What is your favorite non-religious book that you'd recommend to somebody to read? Did I stump you?
It's because it's the embarrassment of riches I read a lot.
Is there a favorite author you have, maybe?
See, here's the deal. I'm a science fiction fan, big time. and I've been reading science fiction since I was like 7 years old. So, and I'm a fan. Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, Theodore Sturgeon, um, uh, um, any of those guys from that era. Love them all. Philip Jose Farmer, Philip K. Dick, David Gerald. You know, there's just there's so many. And there's actually oh man, you know, there's the Necronomicon. There's so many. There's the Diamond Age. There's Snow Queen. There's so many books that are all that sort of stuff that are kind of fantasy and science fiction. But I'm really much more like a Poul Anderson fan of the real like hard science fiction. Robert Silverberg, Ringworld, you know, all that sort of stuff. I love that stuff. Where it's not fantasy, it's mostly, you know, really hard science.
Right.
Sure. Harlan Ellison's A Boy and His Dog.
Okay.
There you go.
I've recently gotten into Christopher Moore, who is a comedian writer. I'm glad somebody else knows who he is, finally. I've talked to a couple different people on and off air, and people are like, who? Like,
Yeah.
But I just got done with the Pine Cove trilogy, actually.
Good stuff.
So my story.
Yeah. Wait, I'm gonna sit back. Go ahead.
Gotta relax now.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I mentioned the whole Roman Catholic thing.
Mm-hmm.
I was born in 1985 into a family that I don't actually know too well. All I really know is that I was physically abused. It was lack of protection from my birth mother.
Mm-hmm.
At 2 years old, I was removed from that family and put with what I considered to be my family. Which is my adoptive mother, my adoptive father, and 4 brothers.
Right.
One of which had passed away before I came along. And the whole reason that my family had gotten into foster care was they had not passed through that grieving process of losing my brother David in 1984. So in 87, they were still trying to get past that, and the family preacher had told them, well, you need to open your heart to someone like Jesus opened his heart to you. So, and that's a story that I've grown up with, is this story of you need to open your heart like Jesus did. Let the children come to you, as it was.
Right.
So time goes on, and we actually had a baptism/adoption party, where we had a party for both at the same time. And when I went to the judge and they have to ask the child, you know, well, what is your, you know, how do you view this? Well, mom will always be mom, dad will always be dad. You know, I went through the list of family members, and God will always be God, was part of my answer. So in 2 years, I was adopted at 4 years old, I had already gotten into that indoctrination and understood, all right, this is what I'm supposed to believe. Hopped down the road. We moved around a lot as I was a kid. My dad was an electrical engineer. He worked with Texas Instruments, Siemens Corporation, Chrysler. So we moved around a lot because they were like, oh, we need you here. So we moved to Texas, and I remember cutting out a bunch of little tiny colored cardboard construction paper fish, and writing on the back of them different Bible verses that were supposed to be inspirational, and on the front I had written the INRV or whatever it is that was supposed to be on the crucifix. And I wouldn't give them out to just anybody. I'd gone to the mall, and I think I had like 300 of these things.
Wow.
I actually would wait and watch people. And in my mind, I was listening to hear God talk to me and say,
Wow.
that person there needs one. And people would come up to me and say, well, I'd like one. I'm like, well, sorry, God is telling me that you don't need this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where I came up with that idea. We moved to California a year and a half after that, and I was put into. Oh, I also got my first communion when I was in Texas, and I talked a little bit about the concept of the being more excited about the fact that I got to drink wine than I think I was about actually having
Eating
first
flesh and
communion.
blood, yeah.
Right. Um, which is rather disturbing when you think about it now, whole cannibalism thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I went to a Roman Catholic church in and private school when I was in California, and all the way through 10th grade actually. And the school didn't have a religion course at it, which was kind of strange for me and my family.
Mm-hmm.
So my mom actually asked the principal, who was an ex-nun, and I didn't know the story behind that until later on. Um, why don't you have a religion course? This is a Roman Catholic school. I sent my daughter here so that she could be brought up in the religion. Well, we don't want to offend all of the non-Catholics going here. Now, the weird thing is every Friday we went to church.
Mm-hmm.
You had to go to church every Friday.
Right,
That was part of
right.
school. So,
Huh.
but I learned later on that the whole reason why the nun was an ex-nun was she had violated her vow of chastity.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't occur to me as a child, oh, she has a son. I didn't know what chastity was. I had no idea what sex even was until I got to public school in 11th grade. So we moved to Michigan, which is where my parents were born. And I went to another Roman Catholic school. There wasn't too much spectacular that happened there, except that by this point, I had a feeling that I could see the auras around people, or at the time I called them halos.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why you had a halo before you were dead. I don't know. And I also had this sense that I was able to see demons as well.
Wow.
So I had suddenly gotten into this almost like a panic that when I would look outside at night, I got really scared that I was going to see something out there that was going to attack people or possibly attack me. And I'll explain a little bit later how I actually figured out what exactly I was seeing, because I was actually seeing stuff.
Something. Okay. Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't what I thought I was seeing. We moved to Chicago, and you were talking about hallucinations earlier, and I have come to realize that this was me forcing the concept upon myself, but at the time, we were looking for houses, and it was a 2-story house. And when I walked in, I immediately felt creeped out. This was a newly remodeled house. Everything was fresh, painted, new carpet, new drywall in one room. But when I walked in, I knew something was wrong. I felt weirded out about this house. Now, I don't know if you've watched any of the new Ghostbuster myth things on, I think it's on the Nat Geo channel or whatever. They actually explain that if you have uncoded electrical wires, some people actually receive that electrical interference as being this paranormal feeling.
Sure.
So my mind made up this creature that I was seeing in a bedroom. And the weird thing that happened, we found out later that the whole reason why that particular house had been remodeled is because the father kind of whacked out and shot everybody. So my mind at the time was like, oh my gosh, I
Right.
saw a demon in that house. That's why I was creeped out.
Right.
Of course,
Of
now I
course.
realized that what had happened is because he had shot, the walls had to be redone, the wiring and electrical had to be redone, and the wires weren't insulated.
Wow.
And I was picking up on that electrical field and feeling
Sure.
weirded out.
Sure.
So we moved back to Michigan with this thought in my head of I saw a demon, God was talking to me, there must be some purpose for me. And then things got a little bit psycho in a way. My dad passed away in 99.
Hmm.
He was studying to become a deacon at the time, and I was in ninth grade. So, and the way the Catholic Church works is you have the deacon, which is allowed to get married and have kids, and then if you're not married, if you don't have kids, then you can go to the next level and become a priest.
Priest, right?
And then you priest to bishop to cardinal, and then of course the big guy, the Pope,
Right. Right.
which everybody has issues with. Um, um, so Dad died, and all of a sudden it was this sudden release and flood of information. Up until that point, I had had Roman Catholic only. There was nothing else. It wasn't super controlled as to what I could watch, but I wasn't allowed to watch PG-13 movies until I got 13.
Hmm.
So there was
Wow.
always that constant child fantasy movies, all that kind of thing. And then I suddenly got this influx of, oh, hey, there is Norse mythology, Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology. Oh, there's something called Wiccan?
Hmm.
So I was going to church, and I was like, all right, so there are other cultures who believe that they have the ability to heal through touch, to exorcise demons through touch. And of course, I already had that in my mind of, okay, I saw a demon in Chicago. There must be some sort of plan for me going on here. And I don't know how, but I got it in my head that I had the ability to heal people's spirits through my own touch.
Hmm. Wow.
So there was that for a little while. I got involved in the Sunday worship program with Life Teen is what they call it. And it
How
was a
old were you
thing.
then?
Oh geez, ninth and 10th grade.
Uh-huh. Okay.
I don't quite know how old I was at the time. I could figure it out if I actually bothered to, but that gives you an idea of the
Sure.
age range that I was
Yeah.
in. Maybe 14, 15, somewhere in there.
Right.
In 10th grade, my religion teacher in the religious histories class is what it was. It was supposed to be specifically Christian, Roman Catholic history. And that led into some issues once I went to public school. But we had an assignment to draw a world religion out of a hat. And then we had to write about the evils of that religion.
Wow.
Somebody across the room pulled Islam.
Of course.
I pulled Wiccan.
Wow.
Wicca, witchcraft.
Sure.
Now, I just recently rearranged my room, but
Uh-huh.
there's normally pendulums hanging above my desk. At that school, there was a girl, Erica, whom I initially caught my attention because I thought she was pretty. Now, this
Uh-huh.
was before I realized that I was bisexual. I just
Uh-huh.
thought, oh, she's pretty, and
Yeah.
But her
So,
pentacle
so
had popped out of her shirt.
was
Oh,
it
yeah,
the
go
whole
ahead.
like goddess idea that got you interested as that you found attractive in Wicca?
Kind of. Talking with Erica, she had explained to me about the concept of in nature everything has a spirit.
Spirit, right? Animus.
And with what I was thinking that I was seeing, I'm like, well, wait a minute. I noticed what I thought were creatures that nobody else was seeing.
Right.
And she was explaining that the idea of the goat god Pan was
Mhm.
readapted to represent Beelzebub,
Right.
Lucifer, whatever you want to call that entity.
Right.
And I was like, well, okay, so if they've been rewritten to do this, what else has Christianity rewritten to make it look evil? Because I was talking to this girl, she wasn't a bad person. She wasn't trying to sacrifice doves in the middle of the night to
Right.
some satanic thing. She was just like, no, and I'm a very peaceful individual. I hate the fact that we got this assignment because I am Wiccan. I'm not an evil person. I'm not trying to cook the baby with its mother's milk kind of thing.
Right.
Although cheeseburgers are very good.
Yeah.
Um, so I silently kind of shifted. I had also suddenly been exposed to Japanese culture through
Mm-hmm.
anime, and in a roundabout way, Shintoism and all the spirits and nature
Ancestor
gods.
worship.
Right, all that. So I'm like, this is really interesting. I didn't get this before when I was a kid. So I shifted into this mindset of, all right, maybe God is there, but he's kind of like Zeus. And then all the angels, when they came down, were misinterpreted as the gods and deities of all the different religions.
Mm-hmm.
So I went into that mindset for a little while. And
Wow.
then I was like, all right, now maybe there were just some creatures playing pranks on people, be it aliens or whatever. And I kind of went into this, all right, maybe there is a moon goddess, maybe there's not, maybe there's a god of the earth, the sea, and all that. So I shifted into this kind of pseudo-Wiccan,
Mm.
where I wasn't really following the major Wiccan concepts. Um, I I dabbled a little bit in the casting of spells and herbalism and stuff like that, but seeing that it had about the same effect as prayer,
Right.
um,
Right. Nothing feels like
I
prayer.
kind of dropped out of that. I kind of dropped out of that. I actually distinctly remember the thing that convinced me that prayer didn't work, that God wasn't listening.
Uh-huh.
When my dad was in the hospital, he was diagnosed with cancer. 3 weeks later, he was dead.
Wow.
So huge shock to the system. I actually don't remember all that much about what was going on. I remember the layout of the waiting room. I
Mm-hmm.
remember my brother shaking me because I wasn't crying. I physically couldn't cry. But I remember saying a prayer out loud in the middle of the church. I had walked down the street. We lived 3 blocks from the church. And it's a big rotund cathedral type church. I walked up to the altar, which you're not supposed to do.
Right.
Set both my hands on it, flat on, looked straight up, said, God, if you do not save my dad, the devil has a new bitch. And walked
Wow.
out. Apparently God didn't
Wow.
care.
Yeah.
And of course at the time I was pissed off. I was angry at
Right.
God.
Well, apparently.
So that kind of yeah. So that kind of drove me into looking into the other
Uh-huh.
religions. When I well, not really graduated, when I completed 10th grade, we no longer, because of my dad's death, no longer had the ability to pay the tuition for the private school, for the Catholic school.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to, uniquely enough, the high school that my mother had gone to. And I
Wow.
actually went there for the last 2 years that it was open under that name, and she went there for the first year that it was opened under that name.
Wow.
But the first week, and to give you an idea of where this is, Kimball High School at the time is 45 minutes outside of Detroit, Michigan.
Okay.
So you can
Mm-hmm.
imagine we have a rather large population of black people
Sure.
at this high school. I'm walking down the hallway, and you've seen those decorative glass cube window things that you can't really
Yes.
see through.
Right,
Right.
right, right, right. Yep.
Part of our hallway was made of those, and it was in
Mm-hmm.
front of the auditorium. And all of a sudden, I hear this scream and the sound of glass shattering. Two girls were fighting over who had hair extensions. Neither one of
Right.
them did.
Right, right.
But the sound that I heard was somebody's head going into one of those.
Sure.
So I spin around and nearly smack into a guy who's wearing a pentacle. I'm like, wait, you're wearing this out of your shirt. Because when we were at the Catholic school, you didn't wear religious symbols unless it was a crucifix or a cross.
Sure.
Nothing else. I mean, I knew we had Jews at the school, but they kept their star inside their shirt because they
Right.
didn't want to get in trouble.
Yeah.
So it was kind of this shock of like, wait, your people are okay with this?
Hmm.
So as a result of that, I started actually asking people, well, what do you believe? What do you believe? How do you follow this? And I kind of gradually stepped down into more of a deistic or pantheistic ideal of how the universe worked. Like, okay, maybe nobody's really listening at all, no matter who it is.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's just that the universe is
Right.
You know, the I am thing. Graduated high school with that concept that I was still seeing things, and I came to the conclusion then, and I still kind of hold to this concept of we have the concept of string theory and plane theory and different dimensions and all that.
Yep.
What happens if they bump? Is this what we are interpreting as supernatural or paranormal experiences? Whether or not that's actually a legit explanation, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just something that I throw out there especially when religious people ask me, well, what's a demon then? Or what about the ghost that I saw? I don't know.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I mean, you may have seen it. I'm not discounting that you saw something.
I have been discounting. Right. I have been told by people that they have seen things, and I believe them that they saw it. Not necessarily, I know this woman who said she woke up and her aunt was sitting at the foot of the bed and told her goodbye, and she went back to sleep and got a phone call, 20 minutes later that her aunt had died in a car accident.
Right.
I believe she saw what she says she saw. Was her aunt there? I doubt it.
Right.
So, but I certainly believe that she saw it. But see, I know that people can hallucinate because I've done it. So,
right.
So that's that. So I have that experience, and so based on that, that would be, that of course is my guess. Stuff that goes on in people's heads. I've certainly seen that. Never actually saw something supernatural. So
right.
Same deal. It's like, yes, yes, the Bible's a book. I've seen people write books. Never seen God write a book.
Right.
So that's the deal. So,
Let's count the Ten Commandments movie.
Yeah, that's a movie. I've seen people make movies.
Right.
They say that, well, if you look at Mount Rushmore, and you come from another planet, you see Mount Rushmore, you have to say, oh, well, that's obviously designed. No, that's obviously designed by human beings, because I've seen human beings do that. I've never seen anything else do that. That's the deal. That's the only, so that whole thing, if it's designed because it looks like design, no. It's designed if it looks like it was designed by people. Otherwise, doesn't look like design to me, because I don't know what design by anything else looks like, because I've never seen it.
Right.
Okay, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
So no, you're fine. It's actually a good cutoff point, because I actually organized where I was according to what school I was in.
Okay.
So and what state I was in. So it's easy for me to cut off at 12th grade. And I had actually come to a strange adoption of Egyptology. And I still have some of my little statues around. I actually can look up and see 2 statues of Bast and one of Anubis. I had come to this conclusion that, all right, the things that people addressed as deities way back when were not wholly constructs of their own mind. They had actually witnessed something, be it a creature from another planet that had come down, maybe what I'm seeing, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I had started researching very specifically Anubis himself, because for some reason I felt attracted to this jackal-headed god. I just thought it was a cool concept, I guess.
Sure.
While still keeping that he wasn't actually a deity. He was just some kind of creature that had come to our planet to say hi, essentially, and help us build shit. And show us, hey, you don't just have to bury the dead, you can embalm them. Which in my mind had somehow got misconstrued into, if you embalm them, they have a better afterlife. And at this point, I had kind of let go of that afterlife concept in the terms of heaven and hell. But okay, maybe we linger around somehow after death. Because this was the era when our digital cameras weren't all that great. And you have a flash going off in a dusty room, you're going to get a crap ton of orbs.
Right.
I have a photo of when I went to an old warehouse, abandoned warehouse in Detroit. And I just pointed the camera in this completely pitch black room and took the photo. And I've tried to count it. I cannot tell you how many photo abnormalities that are known as orbs have shown up in this photo.
Wow.
The creepy thing is the little tiny door across the way. That's the creepy thing.
Cool.
I don't know.
Okay.
But yeah. So I moved to Tennessee, which is where I'm at right now.
Mm-hmm.
And we went to the church that I had actually been baptized in. And they did, the whole communion thing and everything. And they had blush wine, which, if you know anything about the Catholic tradition, is supposed to be red wine.
Right.
It's supposed to be the blood.
Right.
And by going back to church, I kind of said, well, maybe this is right, maybe it isn't, I don't know. But I asked the preacher afterward, because this was 3 weeks in a row that I'd noticed that they'd used blush wine. And Easter was already over with. I kind of forgave them for the whole, it's okay, it's Easter, it's blush, but, it's special occasion. But they kept using it. So I asked the preacher, well, why are you using blush wine? Well, we don't want to stain the linens.
Ta-da.
What? And I actually said to him, I'm like, wait a minute. Jesus was crucified, bled on linens for your and my sins, presumably. And you're worried about spending a little bit extra on a cleaning bill? That, in and of itself, was the one thing that finally solidified to me Christian religion is bullshit.
Bullshit. Yeah.
Of course, then I was like, well, what do I do now? Because with that came the realization of, like, well, maybe all the other religions and what I've construed in my own head is just bullshit as well. So I kind of went through this phase of inactivity in religion. Just nothing. And I met a friend, and met who is my husband at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And Daniel actually introduced me to the term atheist. I didn't know what it was. I'd never heard the term. It wasn't something that came up in my family. The concept of there are people out there who don't believe never came up. There's other religions, but they all believe in God. Everyone in the world believes in God, was what was taught to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I, of course, went on this mad charge. Well, what is atheist? What is atheism? And I think it was the Atheist Experience that I started out with, Matt down in Texas and whatnot. And I had such a backlog that I was listening to that while volunteering at a local fossil site. The Gray Fossil Site in Tennessee, if you are interested in looking it up later.
Mm-hmm. And
I was a docent, a tour guide. And a person came up to me, probably about your age range.
Mm-hmm.
And the site is what's called a wet site, meaning it's not the dry rock like you think of when you think of dinosaur bones.
Sure.
It's a Miocene age site that was a sinkhole and filled up with water and became basically a trap for a lot of creatures.
Right.
But
Right.
you have alligators, tapirs, rhinos, elephants in Northeast Tennessee. I mean, come on.
Right.
So, Chris, I'm explaining that it was a sinkhole with water, and the first thing he asked me is, well, how does this relate to the flood? Flood? What flood? Well, the biblical flood, of course. And I just sat there staring at him. I don't know, actually. He said, well, you know you're telling us the wrong ages, right?
Right.
What? I wasn't brought up with creationism. I didn't know
Right.
what the word was. On starts another flood of me researching.
Sure.
And just facepalm after facepalm after facepalm. I came across something with Psi 10, and I was listening to the debate.
Mm-hmm.
There's a desk behind this that's made out of solid aluminum.
Uh-huh.
At the time, it was a solid wood desk. I ended up with a bruise on my forehead thanks
Sure.
to that man.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
and the more I listened, the more I realized, the more I understood, I don't believe any of this. Well, then I came across the argument about, well, what good is half an eye?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can see it on my camera or not, but this eye here turns a bit.
Yep.
I'm half blind in this eye.
Mm-hmm.
And my eye is actually struggling to see out of the peripheral vision. That's why it turns.
Huh.
Well, when I was really little, it actually turned inward.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the result of what is called congenital toxoplasmosis.
Right.
It's a type of parasite that's carried in cat feces.
Mm-hmm.
And birds as well. My birth mother had changed Mr. Kitty's litter box when she was pregnant.
Yeah.
The parasite goes directly to the uterus and affects the fetus.
Sure.
I was lucky enough that it just caused partial blindness.
Right.
But what I had been seeing all those years that I thought were demons and spirits floating around is actually a very well-known thing called a floater.
Sure.
And it's basically it's a little piece of tissue.
Yeah, I've
that
got
just kind
floaters.
of floats
Yeah,
around.
absolutely.
Yeah, floats around in the eyeball, and
Yeah.
occasionally you see this little black thing streak across.
Yep. Yep. It's just little
That's
bits
what
of
I've
stuff
been
in your aqueous humor. Yep.
Yep. Nobody had explained that to me, so when I was religious, I reinterpreted it as, oh, these are demons I'm seeing. So I
Wow.
got that, and then of course I atheist experience, atheist, pretty much everything. I mean, my podcast list, I have so many backlogs of stuff. It's ridiculous.
I understand. Sure.
And then, of course, I kept getting more questions at the fossil site. Well, how does this relate to this? Well, what about, and then people would drag me off to the side after I got done with the tour, and I had this 2-hour-long conversation with a guy who he'd come in and he'd leave, and he'd come in and he'd leave. And he said to me at one point, I can prove to you using the scientific method that everything science says is wrong. What? What?
Right.
So that led me into, all right, I really need to research this stuff and understand how to combat this.
Right.
And I still wasn't calling myself an atheist at this point. It wasn't until I sat down with Daniel's friend, Kayla, who believed in this spiritualistic shamanism type stuff, but didn't believe in a god. And I had never asked that question to them. Is there a god? I actually flat out asked them that question. And when they said no, I actually suddenly felt really comfortable calling myself an atheist, because I'm like, all right, I believed in this shamanistic, demon-filled world for a long time, but with no god. And I was reluctant to call myself an atheist because I held those other things.
Right.
And when I met somebody else who said, well, yeah, I kind of believe in this stuff, but I don't think there's a god, I suddenly felt, comfortable and actually rather liberated, because I didn't feel that I can't call myself this because I'm grabbing onto some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
During this sudden rush of freedom, I ended up making an art gallery online that has little animated GIF images of just a bunch of stuff. You know, millions are good without God. Here's a quote from Thomas Jefferson. God is not real. God can't love you because he's not real. Satan can't hate you because he's not real. Something about Fred Phelps, you know something's wrong when the KKK hates you too.
Right.
Went through that angry atheist phase.
Yep.
And then I came across Seth Andrews. And got this blast in my face of, you don't need to be aggressive about it. Nobody's going to listen.
Right.
And then I came across Smalley on that, and it was the same thing. And listening to Dogma Debate, it's like, well, okay, I listened to Matt, and I like Matt because of the fact that he can immediately pull out, that's a fallacy, that's a fallacy, that's a fallacy, here's why you're wrong, here's why you're wrong, here's why you're wrong. But and as much as I like Matt, I also find people just put up that wall. Like, he's too aggressive, he's too in my face. Whereas with Seth and David, it's like, well, why? Tell me why. Explain to me. And that's kind of where I got the idea to do this, is I want to know why at this point. I know why I believed, because I was raised with it. Mm-hmm. I had that nobody loved me when I was 2 years old. And all of a sudden, not only do I have a family, but I have this being who is completely loving, has loved me the entire time, and it was that sudden acceptance.
Sure.
So I know why I did, and I want to know why other people did. And I know a lot of it is, I was raised with it. But then there's other people who converted from Islam to Christianity, or I think Dawkins interviewed, I think it was a Jew who converted to Islam. Mm-hmm. So things like that. But yeah, so that's my roundabout, rather long story.
Yeah, well, that was very interesting. Thank you very much. That was very cool.
Yeah, of course. The coming out experience is also something we always get, what happened and how did this go down? I, as a wedding present to myself, got the A tattooed on my lower back in bright red ink, and it's the swoosh A. But I drew it wrong. It's actually my handwriting, but I drew it wrong, so it's a little bit wonky looking. And I was so excited about the fact that I'd actually gotten a tattoo that I couldn't hold it in. 2 weeks before my wedding, I show my mom. Was that some weird tech tattoo or something? Well, no, actually it means I'm an atheist. And here goes Greta Kustina's thing. My mom actually said it. Well, I knew you didn't believe in God, but an atheist?
Right. Yep.
Instant, you are with the Russians, you are a part of the Red Scare, and I just kind of shut down and walked out the door.
Sure.
Thankfully, I wasn't living at home. And prior to all of this, there was actually an incident when I was in high school when I told my mom I'm Wiccan, and she actually grabbed my pajama bottoms while I'm in bed, yanked them off of me, trying to pull me out of the bed, said, "No, you are not Wiccan, you're going to church." So,
yeah.
Sunday morning, I wanted to sleep in.
Sure.
So we didn't touch on that subject for a while, the atheism thing. I was reading A Letter to a Christian Nation, and just in my pure excitement to try and spread knowledge, I read to my mom part of the Treaty of Tripoli. And she's of that school of, America is a Christian nation. It was
Judeo-Christian. They love that term. Yeah.
Yeah. So I read this to her, and she said, "Oh, you're just reading atheist literature. That's not real." Mom, you can go to the White House and ask for a copy of this treaty. They can show you. This is not just Danielle. You don't need to be talking about this. And yes, I realize you just said my name on air, but
Yep,
whatever.
there you go.
Um,
What do you
hey, I'm not saying my last name.
Okay.
Um, so it was kind of this shock, like, well, Mom, you've been really accepting of, we've had Jewish friends. I know we had at least one person that Mom knew of that was Islamic.
Hmm.
One of my schools had a Jewish Hanukkah and Passover celebration. So, I mean, she was really accepting of all that. And then all of a sudden I get this pushback of, no, you don't talk about that.
Hmm.
Okay. Um, and over the course of a couple years, there was a conversation in the car where I tried to talk about it with my mom, and the subject of my dad came up and heaven, and Mom actually started having a panic attack.
Right.
I had to stop talking about it and say, all right, we obviously need to switch the subject here. And then I think it was last year that Seth had the Silly Superstitions show.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I had Mom sit down in the car with me. We were going somewhere. And I said, all right, Mom, here's my phone. This is going to be playing a podcast. And I'd really like to listen to it with you. And I know there might be some things that come up that you find offensive. If at any time you find them offensive, just pull this cord out and it'll stop. She listened to the whole thing.
Wow.
She actually had me bring it inside and continue playing it so she could listen to the rest of it. That ended up sparking a 4-hour conversation with my
Wow.
mom about
Great.
how my mind has changed on abortion, how it's changed on gay rights, assisted suicide, the whole thing. Now, there are some things that I'm on the same page, but in a different paragraph with my mom. Birth control, or not birth control, but abortion being one of them. We're on the same page, just she doesn't like the idea of abortion safe for medical, and I'm like, I can see it in however the woman wants to go about it.
Right.
So, gay marriage, same page, different paragraph again.
Right. Right.
Call it a civil union, don't call it a marriage. So,
Right.
okay.
That's just
Okay. At least you're okay with the idea of them having a family. Okay.
right. Right.
So, and then there's other things that we're just like, all right, we don't talk about this, such as the heaven and hell and sinning and all that kind of thing. We just don't talk about it.
I think that is where actually a lot of our initial angry atheism comes from, is because we need some of those things to be true, and they're not. Because you're not going to see your parents, and you're not going to see your grandparents, and you're not going to see your brothers and your sisters again. When they're gone, they're gone, and when you're gone, you're gone. And that is the biggest disappointment. That is the hardest thing to deal with. So that's where our anger comes from. Almost always, when I see angry atheists, that's what they're angry about. They're angry about, damn it, I need to talk to my mother again. I'm sorry.
Right.
And it's not their fault that it's not true. It's their fault that they tried to persuade you, but it really, even then, again, if you look at it using the infection paradigm that Peter Boghossian likes to use, that's really what it is. It's an infection, and you can see it. The infection is strong sometimes, and the infection is weaker in other people. But a lot of times that's the last thing people hold on to, is because they desperately want to see somebody again, and that's what they hold on to. I saw it. You know, my mother wanted to see people again. My parents are gone now, but you know, my, you know, I could never get her to the point where I was like, well, you're not going to see me. How are you going to feel about that? Her belief
Yeah.
was God will eliminate anybody's memories about those people who are in their families so that they won't be unhappy while they're in heaven.
Interesting.
And yes, and actually that's a pretty common thread that you'll hear from people. Well, look, Mom, if you're gonna be in heaven looking down on your son burning in hell, God will wipe away my memory of you so that I won't be unhappy. My question is, okay, if you take my mother and wipe away everything she knows about me, is that really her?
Right.
Okay. Well, I can tell you that there's at least 3 out of her 5 kids would be have no memory of that. That means that the 60 years she knew, or the 55 years she knew me, gone. So what is left of her? If somebody, and the whole thing about somehow your personality surviving death. I had a friend who had a stroke, a very minimal stroke. You wouldn't know that he had anything happen to him. When his wife and son came to visit him in the hospital, he looked at them, he knew them, he knew that was his wife, he remembered everything about them. He just no longer had any emotional attachment to either of them. The cells in his brain that had love for his wife and child were gone. Okay? So if a half a dozen cells can take your love for your wife and son. This guy looked at me, he's a friend of mine, he said, he was in the healthcare field. He said, my son, I could have taken him, if something happened to him and I had to give him a tracheotomy, I could have done it right then, right there. Wouldn't have bothered me a bit. Whereas a week previous, he remembered loving his son. And he knew that a week before that, he could never have done that kind of thing for his son because he would have been so emotional about it, he never would have been able to complete the tracheotomy.
Right.
He eventually relearned how to care and love them. But that emotional attachment disappeared with the half dozen cells in his brain that got damaged by the stroke. If somebody's love in a very simple little stroke can disappear in just a little bit, just a few brain cells, how possibly can your entire personality transcend the death of your entire brain?
Right.
And that's what I tried to explain to my mother, and that's when you get to the wall with them, because they desperately need to see all those people who've gone before, and that's when they're saying, that's it, and they shut it off, poof. And so, yeah, so I understand totally about there's stuff that you just can't talk to your mom about.
Yeah. It's like, I mean, obviously by my name, it's evident that I'm very much into paleontology.
Right.
And I would dearly like to share some of the anthropology stuff that's been recently discovered, like one of the oldest known primate species that might possibly actually lead up to Homo sapien and such. And she knows the fossils are there. She knows it's an evolutionary lineage leading up to humans. Except that humans didn't evolve.
Right.
In her mind, anyway. We don't have ancestors. Humans are classified as apes. Well,
right.
Yeah, but we're not really animals. We have a soul. Nothing else does. Well, what about Adam and Eve? Were they Homo sapien? Were they Homo erectus? Homo neanderthalensis? She's like, no, they were Adam and Eve.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
So,
just like us, in God's image.
Right.
Right. So, which means, I guess, Homo erectus, Homo Neanderthal, Homo Neanderthalensis, Denisovans were not in the image of God. They looked a lot alike.
Yeah. Who knows?
Yeah. So, yes, of course, they have to shield themselves from that information because their infection is strong.
Right.
And it forces them to do that. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. And of course, my mom she's in her 70s now, and something I was able to stress to her the other day, amidst tears, because I had come out to her as bisexual, not sad tears, actually, rather happy tears, was that, Mom, I am not trying to deconvert you when I talk about my atheism. I just need an outlet. I am excited about things I'm finding out, and I need to talk to somebody about it. I want to talk to somebody about it. I'm not trying to attack your faith. Right. I'm not trying to deconvert you. I'm just trying to vent.
And treat her like a friend.
Right. And and she actually asked me, well, what is an atheist then? Aren't you just angry at God? Like, well, no, actually. Yeah. Well, then you say there's absolutely no God. Well, no, actually. I classify myself as an agnostic atheist if somebody flat out asks me.
Right.
Where atheist is the belief stance and agnostic is the knowledge stance. And my mom was in debate club when she was younger, so she completely understood what I meant immediately by that.
Oh, very good.
And she just kind of looked at me, she's like, so you're not trying to rip down people's faith? No, not at all.
Yeah.
That's an anti-theist.
Yeah.
That's an anti-theist. And while I probably did fall into that category for a little while, I don't now. Now I'm just curious. So I think she was like, all right, I can deal with this. She's still not happy that I'm an atheist. She's not happy that I am bisexual, but she is happy that I know who I am and that I'm okay with who I am.
So do you celebrate holidays with her? So are you a secular Catholic, a cultural Catholic?
In some senses, yes. Like she'll invite the family over for Christmas.
Right.
Whereas a couple days earlier, I have celebrated the Festival of Lights with myself and whomever else happens to come over.
Right.
I decorate in red and gold, and on the winter solstice, I use only candles to light the house.
Yay!
Just because it's kind of a carryover from Wicca, but also, hey, this is how it was originally celebrated.
Yeah, that's right. And whatever makes you happy.
Right. And then, of course,
as a species, we've been celebrating, those changes for a long, long time.
Right. Yeah. So, of course, I get invited for Christmas, and all right, you're celebrating it as Christmas on the 25th of December. Inevitably, when I was younger and still now, we end up opening one present on the 24th.
Right, of course.
So my mind kind of melds the two together.
I understand.
So when I go over there, all right, it's Christmas. Secretly under the table, when they pray, I'm doing that.
Right, I understand. Yeah, well,
Simply because it's like, guys, who made the food. We have a vague idea of who killed the turkey that's on the table.
Right.
I don't know. This past Easter, for myself, I just bought a lot of candy. I'm like, I'm just going to pig out on the little pastel egg things that I like. But, we got invited over, my husband and I, and I don't know if you've ever heard the dogwood story or not. Okay. Supposedly, the dogwood used to be this great and mighty tree. And when the Romans or whoever it was went to crucify anybody, they used the dogwood because it was such this great sturdy wood. So, of course, Jesus was crucified on dogwood.
Uh-huh.
And while he's on this, the tree itself starts weeping as well. And Jesus says to the tree, from this point on, you shall never be used to be, torturous or
Right,
whatever.
right, right,
And the
right, right.
dogwood kind of shrivels up like the fig tree and turns into this
Right.
naughty thing that we see today.
Yeah.
And the flowers reflect Jesus. And the center is like the crown of thorns. The petals are in the shape of a cross.
Uh-huh.
And on the points, there's this little rust-colored notch in them that's supposed to be the 4 points of which Jesus was crucified. So this story starts going around the table and whatnot, and inevitably they kind of look at me because they know I'm the more outspoken of the two. Well, I'm sitting there just kind of like this, tapping at my phone a little bit lower so that they can't really see what I'm doing. There are X amount number of species of dogwood. They are all considered to be bushes.
And
all I said.
Yep.
Everybody at the table went silent, and then they just started carrying their used dishes into the kitchen.
There you go.
Talking about something else. And my nephew, who was sitting next to me, he's like, "Can I read that?"
Very good.
So I handed it to him. He's still, he just graduated from high school, so he's still in that kind of phase, and he didn't exactly have the best of life when he was a kid, so he kind of clings to that religious idea, but he knows that I'm not religious. My sister-in-law knows that I am an atheist explicitly. My youngest out of my nephews the other day saw my Darwin fish tattoo on my ankle when we were swimming. Who's Darwin? What?
Wow.
Yeah, so I said, well, Darwin was the naturalist scientist who showed us how evolution works by a mechanism called natural selection. Okay. You just swam off.
Go. Right.
And my sister-in-law kind of cocked an eyebrow at me, and I said, well, it's true. She just kind of shook her head a little bit, like, no, it's not. Not saying it, but you could tell just by the way she behaved that I fear what my nephew is being taught. So.
Yeah, we're in it for the species,
Yeah.
That's why we can only hope that we will live in a. The deal is, and I actually wrote a little something about this in the Dogma Debate volunteer group, and I think I'm going to put together a little either audio or video rant about it, about how we don't hate them, but they hate us.
Yes.
In the early days of the Civil War, I can't believe I'm going into this, but in the early days of the Civil War, the South won most of the skirmishes and battles. And after every battle, the Confederate Army and the Union Army sent out a detail of men to go out onto the battlefield and to identify and bury their dead and take all the personal effects off of their dead soldiers. Things like guns and boots were considered loot for whichever side won the battle, and so they were left on the soldiers, and the people who won would actually get those. But after one really nasty battle, a young lieutenant who was in charge of the Union burial detail, surveyed the battlefield and looked, and he was very dismayed by the grisly state that all of the Union soldiers who were dead were in versus what the Confederate soldiers looked like. And he saw the Confederate detail on the battlefield, and he went up to the commander, who was a little bit older, and he had to ask him. He said, "Why are your men so brutal, and why do they fight so hard?" And the Confederate commander understood instantly that what this young lieutenant did not understand was why his men fought so passionately. And they didn't just kill the Union soldiers. They killed them and killed them and killed them. And the way he answered was, he said, "You don't hate us." And what he was saying was, "But we hate you." And that's why your men look like that and our men look like this. Okay? Now, 150 years later, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are very familiar with the motto that the South will rise again, and who called the Civil War the late great unpleasantness. And that story of the fact that they believe the South will rise again is passed down and reiterated in backyards and bars and restaurants and schools and pulpits in thousands and thousands of places across the South. 150 years later, and they still hate us. And by us, I mean people who don't hate people just because of their color or religion or politics. That's 150 years later.
I can drive down the street. Yeah, I can drive down the street and see a Confederate flag.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay? And this is 150 years later. So here's the deal. The Union had the high ground throughout the war, and eventually, after thousands and thousands of Union soldiers died, they learned how to hate the rebel soldiers, and they were just as brutal. Okay, it wasn't that way at the beginning, but they certainly learned that. After we win, it's not going to happen during my lifetime that we're in a post-religious society, that this is a post-religious society. And it may happen during your lifetime, but it won't happen during mine. I'm sure of it. Those people who are alive now and can look and see and who are enlightened and then eventually end up in a post-religious society need to remember the South, because they're still going to hate us. Even though we will win, and one day it'll be a post-religious society, because we're in it for the species. You cannot use the story of Noah to deny climate change without killing everybody, okay? And eventually that has to fall. So we will win, and they will still hate us. And we have to remember that. Now, we're not killing them. So it's probably not going to last 150 years, but they think that we're killing millions of babies, and they think we are sending millions of souls to Satan. And that's where their anger comes from. And they're still going to hate us. Okay? Now, I think that gives us the moral high ground, just like it gave the Union the moral high ground at first, because they didn't hate. What they were doing was trying to correct a situation and keep the country together. And we are basically trying to correct the situation and keep our species alive, okay?
Yeah.
But they're still going to hate us, and we have to remember that. And we have to remember that that's why we have to work so hard. And that's the reason why I do what I do, because I know that they're going to hate us. And I know that Matt Dillahunty and Dave Silverman's approach is not going to change that. But that maybe Seth Andrews and David Smalley's approach might. And that's the reason why I do it.
I think that is actually an excellent exit for the show, actually.
And there you go. We ended on the Civil War. We needed some fiddle music playing behind that.
And on that bombshell.
There you go.
My best DPR impression. Yeah. Thank you very much for attending.
My pleasure.
Great conversation with you. Feel free to share the video wherever you want to.
Absolutely, of course I will. Yep.
And I do hope that this catches on, and hopefully we'll end up with some betterment for society.
Yep, I agree. Thank you very much. I had a great time.
Thank you.
and you are finding your voice. I think that's a wonderful thing. Good for you.
I'm trying.
And yeah, that's right. You are, and you're doing well. So good deal. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Have a good
Okay.
evening.
Great. Thanks. Good night.
Good night.